Today, we will answer the question, how might psychedelic filter theories of consciousness help to engender ecological awareness? To answer this question, I will begin by elucidating how limited ecological awareness, which gives rise to the ecological and welfare issues we see in the world, is facilitated because the fundamental debates on these issues are merely normative, meaning they'll go around in circles forever. I'll be calling upon a certain famous philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived through, identified, and wrote about a critical juncture in human history. He was able to look back on the old world, identify the cultural and psychological changes that had been taking place, and make accurate predictions about what would come to pass in the future as a result. I believe his writings are crucial to us being able to look past the veil of moral relativism that plagues our society. I will go on to reconcile findings from various scientific fields under a psychedelic filter theory rubric, findings that Nietzsche could not have foreseen, and which essentially amount to puzzle pieces, which, when put together, lead us back to the world we have lost, however knowing it for the first time. I will then attempt to expound how the new worldview I have put forward will engender enhanced, widespread ecological awareness. So, let's think about the ecological and welfare issues that we see. Despite huge public and lobbyist pressure and corresponding policies and pledges from all sides of political divides, despite ecological surveys that inform us of the state of our ecosystems, despite climate science, despite environmental and animal welfare organisations, and despite enforced laws that reflect their interests, we still see fly tipping, we still see industrial waste, pesticide runoff, and untreated sewage dumped in our rivers. Our food still comes wrapped in single-use plastic. We still see heinous crimes against animals, and the RSPCA are always busy. How can this be? Well, first, let's establish that people don't only fall into either of these two categories, as upon further analysis, there is lots of underlying nuance. There are many people who are deeply worried about these issues and would love to prioritise them, and it's only for practical and economic reasons that they don't rescue every mistreated creature on the planet, purchase only organic food free from plastic packaging, and spend time and resources caring for ecosystems. Then there are others that do prioritise these issues and go to great lengths for the sake of them. There are other people who agree with the sentiments, but leverage other types of data to say, look, we can have our cake and eat it too. If we make people as rich as possible as fast as possible, they'll start to care about the environment. There are other people, often decent people, for whom these issues are a distant reality, which doesn't really concern them. And then there is a strange faction of people who reason, I can harm creatures, even other people. Why shouldn't I? Now, in the latter two instances, I make what I feel are quite reasonable inferences. I say, the worldview of these people must be one of separation from others and the environment. I call it a materialist worldview because to them, the perceived material boundaries between us are absolute, and therefore one can get along just fine in life only worrying about oneself. Now, I also think this can be applied to some extent to the other categories of people I have outlined, but in the case of the latter two, I also infer that these people have reasoned their way to nihilism, since their behaviour and their words suggest that they have lost sight of the point of caring for others. We're all going to die anyway, right? Now, whether you feel that we should prioritise economic prosperity for the sake of doing the right thing, or you think we should deindustrialise for the sake of doing the right thing, or you're too preoccupied with looking after your family to even think about doing what you would consider to be the right thing. How often do you hear any of these people doing a good job of explaining what the point of life is, what the point of living in service and in love is? How often do they give an argument other than this is what we should be doing? We should care about the welfare of animals and others. We should care about ecosystems. We should care about maintaining our health and the impact of pollution on our health. My observation is that these arguments hold as much water as the arguments of people who say, why should I? How often, if ever, are nihilistic people, however severe the case, presented with a true antidote to nihilism, an alternative to the materialist worldview which would allow them to reason their way back to, well, to love? Now, before I even mention Nietzsche, what I observe to be happening here is people seem to be defining their own morals and values. However largely our society is in the Anglosphere echo-culturally Christian, This has begun to ring hollow now. However deeply sensitive many people are to a moral order of reality, we're terrible at articulating it and must attempt to do so from within culturally acceptable materialist language. Language which can lead one to the broader conclusion that our morals and values are merely relative. And so some people are left vulnerable to ideology, some of which are destructive. Now, after getting interested in philosophy, I stumbled upon this guy, Friedrich Nietzsche. Speaking just before the onset of the 20th century, he said a shift had been happening, and that it was becoming more widespread that people were having to define their own morals. This caught my attention because, well, he was saying it wasn't always this way. What were we shifting away from? Well, his explanation for why this was happening was because God had died. For some time I had no idea what he meant by this, but now I really do. So, with Nietzsche in the back of my mind, I've gone along educating myself. Here are just 4 things I've learned about that I feel are germane to this discussion. I learned about iterations of Thomas Young's classic double-slit experiment from 1801, brainchild of Richard Feynman. These experiments seem to suggest that consciousness is an essential ingredient of the manifested universe. I learnt that engineers pioneering the technological advancement of AI say that to get a machine to at least act like it can perceive the world, a filter through which sensory input is organized according to a hierarchical structure of prioritized values is necessary. I learned about Dr. Donald D. Hoffman's computer simulations of Darwinian evolution, which demonstrate how any creatures that see the world the way it is die out fast because they don't stand a chance against creatures that see the world in a way that facilitates their survival. And I learned about the persistence of the mind-matter problem, later known as the explanatory gap, now known as the hard problem of consciousness, across time. I learned about Henry Bergson's filter theory of consciousness and read Aldous Huxley's explanations as for why a cerebral reducing valve model gives the most satisfactory account of the human experience, and how advances in neuroimaging techniques gives further credence to such models by allowing psychedelic phenomenology to be mapped onto measurable brain entropy, and by showing that reductions in oscillatory power and cerebral blood flow correlates with the intensity of subjective psychedelic effects. Then reconciled these things and realized if the material realm changes according to the needs of life, or different aspects of it become manifest in our experience, as Bergson would likely suggest, then it makes no sense to say that humans evolve inside a material realm. And in fact, the way to understand it is the experience itself that evolves into the most stable forms, which is a very different statement indeed. And by the fact that we're all present in each other's experiences and not locked in our own personal dimension, our points of reference must be happening within a single, living whole, and to separate between perceiver and perceived must be merely cultural and delusional. As I sit here now, my body and experience is in fact a stable, self-sustaining pattern at the end of a long lineage of human experiences. I'm not myself alive and conscious. Rather, I am a point of reference within a greater living consciousness, and my brain and psyche act as a reducing valve to this. And this worldview in mind, I predict that if I could just find a compound that acted as a disruptor to my neurochemistry and default networks of neuroactivity, this would result in a very intense experience indeed, as I would experience the superficiality of my survival mechanisms, like pain, anxiety, anger, and disgust, and of death. And with increased dosage, the experience would move towards one of ego dissolution as I begin to experience the fact that William Falcus is to me as ideas are to him. Then I remembered Nietzsche calling to me from the 1880s, documenting the spread of the materialist scientist worldview. I realized that they had replaced the something from nothing, eternal miracle of God with the eternal universe, and later the something from nothing miracle of the Big Bang, and that they are elementary particles, causing them only to account for a dead universe, devoid of meaning and morality in their explanations. And, as I would expect, their worldview is walled with paradox in every direction. Whereas, to the people that put the Old Testament together, for example, the miracle was not in their intellect, but before their very eyes. Much like the source of a river is simultaneous to what comes downstream, they witness the divinity of the source of creation present in all forms. Again, I predict a brain function disruptor, whether it be a substance or near death experience, to cause a state of awe as one is exposed to this reality, and I predict that all questions pertaining to the meaning of life will disintegrate upon exposure. To me, the fact that the God of the Bible declares to Moses when Moses asks, "Who are you?" at the paradoxical burning bush that would not burn, "I am that I am," is evidence enough for me that our ancestors are not given the credit they deserve, for their investigation into the nature of the source of creation was as rational, if not more rational, than ours. They used language and imagery differently to us, certainly. Their approach was, if the source of creation from which everything that is or ever could be is downstream, could talk, what would it say? But I believe even this conceptual framework was implemented intentionally, evidenced by the fact that the authors characterize God as saying, "I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end," suggesting that linear time takes place within God. The authors must have realized, firstly, that the source of creation, the only real thing, must be archetypal love itself, since it creates for the sake of itself, and secondly, that it would also appear as calling to them from the future, manifested as conscience, which they symbolized as the voice of a judgmental father, as they struggled to act in accordance with the moral order which gave rise to them before they were consciously aware enough to stray from it. So, what does all this mean? It means Nietzsche was hitting the nail on the head. The European scientific enlightenment had been a correction of course within Christianity, away from corrupt and superstitious sects, but this had begun the process of subjugating the miracle of God into our intellect, which by Nietzsche's time had become widespread, as it is now, bar a few anomalies. But whereas Nietzsche was pessimistic, thinking that civilization would now rest upon the idealization of Übermensch or risk nihilism, unable to foresee from within the 1800s a way out for materialists that kept within the rules of cultural acceptability, we now have the power to reason God back to life in our experience, more alive than ever before. It's time to correct course again. Paradigm shift in worldview I have put forward today shines light on the neurochemical brain as a reducing valve within consciousness, on the corresponding psyche as a filter composed of hierarchically structured values, on experience and reference as the resulting output or generated interface, on our existence as evidence that the input is archetypal playful love and our fundamental identity, on morals and values that support and nurture life as real can be, on life as an instrument to be played, and on psychedelic phenomenology as empirical evidence that this worldview is correct. It shines light on the divinity that pervades us and all forms, on our responsibility to match our software with the nature of the source of creation, on atheism as impossible, and on the fact that some religious folk have not actually found God, and on belief as an impediment to knowing. It shines light on religious and mathematical symbolism alike as superficial necessities, and on ideology, philosophy, and normative debate as shallow and subordinate to experience, that is, our ability to experience our collective third parent, the way, the truth, the light. And as the prevailing materialist worldview begins to disintegrate in favour of us once again becoming aware of our true identity, as the meaning of life becomes self-evident, as does the blessing bestowed upon every human heart that is our duty to one another and our world, I predict that issues concerning ecology and welfare, and the need for political discussions on the matter, will begin to vanish. Thank you for listening.